The dead came to Hushmere at dusk, and Nerys Vale was counting before the barge ever touched her dock. 23. That was the number Ironfang's rider had shouted across the water that morning. 23 fallen in the border skirmish. 23 shrouds needing the crossing to Cinder Isle before the crows found them. She had spent the whole day preparing for 23. 23 squares of grey linen, folded and ready. 23 sprigs of lavender cut and drying on her windowsill. 23 names she did not know yet, waiting to be entered into a ledger that already held 400 others. She counted the shapes lying under their cloths as the barge drifted in on the current. She counted wrong, so she counted again. 24. The lake lay behind her like poured glass, holding the last colour out of the sky, and Nerys stood barefoot at the end of her dock, with her copper braids slipping loose over one shoulder, and her blue-green skirts damp from the spray, and did not move for a long moment. Somewhere across that water, unseen now in the dusk but never far from her thoughts, Cinder Isle held its ring of standing stones the way it had for longer than any living pack could count. The only ground in the north where a fallen wolf was allowed to rest, and the only errand nobody else in 3 valleys would take. 23 of the shapes on the barge lay in careful rows beneath their shrouds. The 24th lay apart, near the stern, uncovered, too large for any linen she owned to have covered him anyway. A wolf, black to the last hair, with a body that filled the space of 2 grown men lying end to end. One ear was torn ragged at the tip. A scar like a seam of beaten silver ran the length of one shoulder, and mud had dried into cracked plates along his flank. His eyes were shut. He did not look like a warrior, owed a place among the honored dead of a border pack. He looked like something that had crawled out of a war and simply stopped, right there, the moment the water was close enough. This much you should know, even though Nerys did not. The wolf was Rydian Varin, Alpha King of the North, ruler of 9 packs, a man whose name alone had ended 2 wars without a single throat torn open. He had slipped past the physicians still arguing over his wounds, and the generals convinced he was riding the eastern line, and gone instead to a battlefield thick with his own dead, and lain down among them, and let himself be loaded onto the burial barge like one more body, because he needed to know, once and for all, who still remembered their names. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He told himself he would rise the moment the barge reached open water. He was wrong on both counts, and had been wrong for 3 days running. Nerys stepped down into the barge, and it dipped and complained under her, the way it always did, and she picked her way between the shrouded rows, without looking at any of them yet, because the living came first, even a wolf who looked as good as dead. She knelt at his side. This close, he smelled of old blood and river silt, and underneath both, something warmer, wood smoke, and something almost sweet, like a hearthstone, that had kept the day's heat long after the fire went out. Not a smell she associated with the dead. She pressed 2 fingers to the thin place behind his foreleg, and waited. Nothing. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button, and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Then, there. One slow heartbeat, so deep it seemed to rise up through the boards of the barge, rather than out of him. Then another, just as unhurried, as if whatever lived in that enormous body had decided that dying was a chore it would see to eventually, and was in no hurry to begin. Nerys did not gasp. She did not call toward the shore, where there was no one to call to. She had learned a long time ago that the dead did not reward panic, and it turned out the not quite dead didn't either. "You're late," she said, quietly, to a wolf she believed could not hear her. His eye opened, amber, and far too aware. If she startled, she folded it away somewhere he couldn't see, the same place she folded everything. She only glanced past him at the 23 who had been promised to her first, and back again. "You'll have to wait," she told him. "The dead go first here. It's the only order I keep." It was, in truth, the only order she had ever needed to keep. She had been keeping it since she was 16, when a fever swept her mountain pack and took 41 wolves in a fortnight, her younger brother Aemon among them, and every elder who might have helped her carry the bodies was too frightened of the sickness to touch them. Nerys had not been frightened, She wrapped her brother in their mother's old blue shawl with her own hands, and by the time the fever burned itself out, the pack had decided that grief looked too much like a curse on her. They had not exiled her, not in so many words. They had simply handed her a small burial boat, stopped meeting her eyes, and let her understand what was being asked of her. 8 years on the Hushmere had taught her the rest. She spoke to no one who could still answer. She asked nothing of anyone. She wrote down every name that crossed her water, because someone had to, and because it had become the only company she knew how to keep. She left the wolf breathing, and worked through what remained of the evening, one shroud at a time, tying a sprig of lavender at each collar, saying each name aloud once, before letting it go under the cloth, the way she always did, the way no war office had ever asked her to. The wolf did not move again, but he was listening to every single name, and something in his chest, something that had spent 9 packs worth of years assuming his soldiers became numbers the moment they fell, was quietly coming apart. When the last of the 23 had been settled, Nerys came back and finally looked at the wound she'd smelled beneath the mud. A long, deep gash at his shoulder, cut far too clean and too narrow to have come from any beast's claw or tooth. She had stitched enough battle wounds to know steel when she saw it, and this cut had none of the wildness of combat. It was precise, almost deliberate, the kind of wound meant to kill quietly, rather than win a fight. A blade, silver by the look of it. "You are not a soldier," she said softly. The amber eye opened again, and held hers, and did not look away. Nerys sat back on her heels, and weighed the small, unbureaucratic choice in front of her. Report what she had found in the morning, or reach for her needle now. She reached for her needle. She hadn't time to do it properly. A tight binding, a few stitches pulled fast enough to hold through the crossing. All the failing light allowed. The wolf didn't flinch under the needle. He barely breathed. By the time she knotted the thread, dusk had gone the color of a bruise, and 23 bodies still waited on a barge that wouldn't row itself to Cinder Isle. So she rowed. The Hushmere at night lay flat and black and close, and Nerys's arms knew the rhythm of it without asking her mind's permission. She talked as she pulled the oar, the way she always did, words meant for no one living. "Not far now," she told the shrouds. "Stone under you by morning. Better than mud." Twice she paused to resettle a slipped wrap, and both times found something wrong beneath the linen. Wounds too narrow and clean for an honest border skirmish. One man had been opened at the throat by something almost gentle. Another bore a mark on his collarbone that was no wound at all, a closed eye ringed in thorns, black as the water beneath them. She had buried 400 wolves. She had never once seen that mark. She took the ledger from under the bench and copied it twice by lantern light, until the lines matched, not knowing, or not letting herself notice, that the wolf's eyes had opened behind her. Rydian watched her check the drawing against the mark a second time, before she was satisfied, and understood, with the unease of a king who has just underestimated someone, that the silent woman with the oar saw far more than she ever said. Cinder Isle rose grey and quiet under its ring of stones, worn smooth by centuries of grief, its barrow cuts already open for whoever the lake sent next. Nerys worked alone and unhurried, settling each man into his cut of earth with the same care, whether he'd been a lord's son or nobody's, tying fresh lavender to each shroud at the grave itself. She had already spoken every name once, back at the dock, so none crossed the water as strangers. She spoke them again now. A name deserved saying twice before the ground closed over it. Once for the crossing, once for the staying. She'd left the black wolf near the stones, too weak yet for more than watching, and had no attention left to spare on why he watched so closely. He knew a dozen of the 23 before she reached their names. He'd trained beside some, promoted to himself, not 4 months past. But it was the 17th grave that undid something in him he'd thought was armored past undoing. Kellen Ash, Nerys read, and tied the lavender. Rydian, still in the grass, remembered a collapsing bridge outside Thornwatch, 3 winters gone, and a hand closing hard around his wrist, a half-second before the span dropped into the ravine. Kellen had never once traded on it, not for rank, not for favor. Nerys straightened the lavender an inch out of habit, and never knew that the wolf beside the stones had stopped breathing for the length of one name. Back at her cabin, she unpicked the hasty dock stitches by firelight, and did the work properly this time, washing the cut clean, drawing out a sliver of buried metal, threading the needle fresh. "If you mean to bite me," she said, not looking up, "do it now, while my hands are clean. I'd rather not stitch a bite on top of everything else tonight." He didn't bite. He watched her instead. The way something learns to watch a hand. It isn't sure, won't become a fist. It never did. She talked while she worked. The storm off the west ridge, a heron near her dock, lavender needing cutting before frost took its scent. The way one talks to an animal, trusted to forgive what it doesn't understand. Nobody had spoken to him like that in 11 years. Not his generals, not his council, not even Darien. When she finally pressed a cloth over the wound, her palm rested against fur gone still. He could smell her that close. Lavender, lake water, wood smoke in her sleeve, and beneath it all, only her, unafraid. His wolf leaned into her hand before he could stop it. Somewhere under his ribs, the pull toward bone and skin, and a voice that could say her name back began to gather. He held it down, barely. 3 valleys east, in Ironfang's hall, Alpha Garrick Thorne heard his rider's report, with a face that cost him effort to hold steady. 23 delivered, buried at Cinder Isle, as arranged. Then the detail he hadn't asked for. The Omega had lingered, opened collars, written things down. Garrick set his cup down carefully, the way a man does when he no longer trusts his own hand. "Which bodies?" he said. "Did she linger over?" The rider didn't know. Garrick sat a long while after, turning a coin he didn't remember picking up, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with silver. If the Omega had seen the marks, Cinder Isle was no longer only a graveyard, it was a witness. Ridian left before first light, while the fire had burned to coals, and Nerys had fallen asleep sitting upright, her ledger open on her knees, one finger still caught between the pages. At the door, he looked back. Once. Something in his chest, not the crowned part, not the part that weighed 9 packs and an unfinished war, said one word, low and certain, the way a wolf's thoughts always were. Mine. He shut it down hard, the way he shut down every impulse a king couldn't afford. He'd come for the mark under a dead man's collar, nothing more. And now that he had it, there was no reason to come back. He told himself that the whole way across the water, in a voice that sounded, even to him, like a man rehearsing a lie he already knew he wouldn't keep. He told himself, crossing the water that first dawn, that he would not go back. He believed it for 4 days. On the 5th, he came bearing a fish, a lake trout, still faintly twitching, dropped without ceremony on her dock boards at dusk, because a wolf, who wished to be mistaken for an ordinary wolf, ought to behave like one. Nerys looked at the fish. She looked at him. "Hungry, are you?" she said, and didn't seem to require an answer. She gutted it there on the dock, cooked half over her small fire, and set the other half down raw in front of him, the way she would for any animal that had decided her dock was worth a second visit. He ate it like a king, pretending not to be starving for company, which was, in its way, exactly true. He came again 6 nights later with a rabbit, dropped with the same wordless ceremony, and this time, she straightened up from her ledger with real irritation.
"You've left blood on my boards,"
she said. "I scrub those. I don't scrub them for you." But she cooked the rabbit too, and didn't ask him to leave before it finished roasting. And Ridian noted, carefully, the way he noted troop movements, that he had not been scolded by anyone in 11 years, and had missed it more than he could have guessed. He came a 3rd time when a storm rolled down off the western ridge and turned the Hushmere to churning pewter, and found her out on the dock in the wind, lashing the burial boat's mooring rope twice over so it wouldn't tear loose in the night. He lay down alongside the hull without being asked, a wall of black fur between the wind and the wood, and she looked at him a long moment before she sat against his side, out of the worst of the rain, and didn't move away. That was the night she told him about Aemon. It came out sideways, the way true things did with her. She was watching the lake and said his name had been Aemon, that he'd been 11, that she'd wrapped him herself in their mother's good blue shawl because no one else would come close enough to touch him. She said the pack had called her death-marked afterward, as though grief were a scent that clung and spread to whoever carried it. She said her mother hadn't spoken to her again before she left, not one word, and that she still didn't know if the silence had been grief or agreement. "That's why the ledger," she said, quiet enough the storm nearly took it. "I don't care what a man dies as. Soldier, traitor, nothing at all. I write what he was born as. A name. Nobody gets buried a number, not on my water." Rydian, who had spent a war counting his losses in tidy columns of digits, said nothing, because there was nothing he trusted himself to say that wouldn't be a lie. She fell asleep against his ribs before the rain let up. He didn't move until she woke. The fourth time, she washed him. He'd come in caked to the shoulder after a night spent scouting Iron Fang's border in wolf form, and she simply fetched a bucket and rag without asking whether he wanted it, the way she did everything now, as if his consent had become a formality between them, rather than a question. She worked the mud from his fur with hands gone rough from oar and ledger and grave digging, unbothered by his size, talking all the while about nothing. A heron nesting in the reeds, lavender needing cutting before frost. He should have minded being handled like livestock. Instead, some long-starved part of him had apparently been waiting its whole life for exactly this, to be touched by someone who wanted nothing from the king, because as far as she knew, there wasn't one anywhere near her dock. By the time she wrung out the rag, his excuse, the mark under a dead man's collar, Iron Fang's border, investigation, had gone thin as smoke. He no longer needed a reason. He wanted to hear her voice work through another story. He wanted to sleep by her fire until dawn made him leave it. His wolf had already decided, in the wordless way wolves decided things, and his crowned and careful mind was only now catching up to the verdict. Darian found the evidence before he found the courage to ask about it. "There's lavender on your collar," he said one morning, tugging Rydian's cloak straight, with the over-familiarity of a man who'd known him since they were both cubs biting each other in the training yard. "And that stitching on your shoulder is finer than any field medic in this hall could manage. Somebody's been sewing you up like you're worth keeping. I am worth keeping. I'm the king. You're also disappearing 3 nights out of 5 and coming back smelling of marsh water and looking." Darian squinted at him, disgustingly peaceful. "It's unsettling. Men have started asking if you've taken ill." "Patrolling," Rydian said. Darian looked south, toward the flat grey line of the Hushmere, just visible past the wall, then back at him, unimpressed. "Your borders are north." Rydian reached for his cup and said nothing at all, and did not meet his oldest friend's eyes. And Darian, wisely, for now, let the silence stand. Autumn had thinned the reeds along the Hushmere by the time the second delivery came. 3 bodies this time, found weeks after the ambush by an Iron Fang patrol clearing brush along the border, and rode to her dock in a cart before anyone thought to send word ahead. Nerys unwrapped them one at a time, the way she always did, and found the mark twice more before she'd finished the first pass. That same closed eye ringed in thorns, inked black beneath 2 separate collars. Not a wound. Never a wound. Someone was branding these men after they died, or before. She couldn't yet say which, and either answer turned her stomach in a way plague victims never had. The cuts troubled her more than the mark. 2 of the 3 had been opened by blades narrower than any raider carried, the kind of clean, economical stroke a soldier learned from his own drill master, not an enemy's. She was picking a torn seam loose to restitch a sleeve for burial when something crackled beneath her fingers. A scrap of parchment, folded to the width of 2 fingers, sewn flat against the lining, where no search would think to look. She worked it free with her belt knife, and read it twice by lamplight, before she let herself believe it. "Tell the king his own gate is open. Iron Fang sells its wolves." No signature, no further explanation. Just a dead man's last honest word, smuggled out the only way he'd had left. She copied it into the ledger, word for word, and hid the original inside the lining of her own coat. Garrick came the following afternoon, alone at her door, though his men waited with the horses at the tree line, which should have reassured her, and did not. He was courteous in the way of a man who had learned that courtesy frightened people faster than shouting ever had, complimented her dock, her lavender, the tidiness of her graves, before he asked, gently, to see her ledger. For my own records, he said, an alpha likes to know his dead are accounted for properly. They're accounted for, Neris said. In my hand. That's the arrangement. I could make it a different arrangement. You could. She did not step back from him, though every instinct told her to. But the dead stopped belonging to you, the moment they stopped breathing, Alpha Garrick. They belonged to whoever loved them. My ledger's how I keep that promise. You'll have to take it from me to change it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, worse than anger, a kind of cold recalculation, before he smiled, thanked her for her time, and left without another word. His men fell in behind him without being signaled. She noted that too. Neris did not sleep well that night, and so she was still awake, mending a net by firelight, when the black wolf came out of the tree line. She told him about Garrick without meaning to, the compliments, the request, the smile that hadn't reached his eyes, the words coming easier to a wolf's silence than they ever had to a person's face. He lay with his head against her knee while she talked, and she rested one hand between his ears, absent, the way she might have soothed herself as much as him. Do you think, she said, after a while, watching the fire rather than him, that people ever tell the truth when they know no one's left who can punish them for lying? She meant the dead man and his scrap of parchment. Ridian heard it as something aimed, however unknowingly, straight at his own chest, and for one unbearable moment did not trust himself to lie still. He had been lying to her every night he'd come to this dock. He was lying to her now, simply by staying. He pressed his head harder into her hand instead of answering, because it was the only honest thing he had left to give her, and she seemed to take it as answer enough. He crossed back before dawn with the parchment's words, Iron Fang sells its wolves, turning over and over beneath his ribs, and by the time he reached his own hall, he had stopped thinking of Garrick as a grieving alpha who'd lost warriors to enemy blades, and started wondering which of the men standing closest to Garrick's chair had grown richer than a border stipend could explain. He said nothing to Darian yet. He simply began asking quiet questions of his own court, the kind that left no trail back to a lake in the south. He did not know, riding home in the grey light, that a soldier who'd delivered the second barge had already reported to Garrick that the Omega had taken something from a dead man's sleeve and hidden it inside her coat. They came for the ledger 3 nights later, after dark, 4 men moving quiet across the yard, toward a cabin, with its single window still lit. They did not reach the door. The black wolf came out of the trees between them and the porch without a sound, and stopped, and did not crouch, and did not growl the low, uncertain growl of a startled animal, deciding whether to run. Moonlight found the silver scar along his shoulder and the torn edge of his ear, and he simply stood and looked at each of them in turn, and one of Garrick's men, a veteran of 2 wars, no stranger to teeth, felt something go cold and certain in his gut. Whatever this was, it had never once, in its life, been afraid of a man holding a blade. The veteran swung first, a broad telegraphed stroke, the kind a man throws when his sword arm has more courage in it than his gut does. Neris was already off the step, barefoot in the cold grass, planting herself at the wolf's shoulder before her own mind caught up to her feet. Stay, she told him, the word she'd use on any dog, fool enough to charge 4 blades. Stay back. He didn't. He met the first stroke by simply not being where it landed, and answered it by closing his jaws around the flat of the blade and wrenching until steel snapped clean at the hilt. The second man he put flat on his back in the mud with a shoulder, winded, whole. He broke 2 more swords before any of the 4 thought to reconsider their orders, and in all of it, not one man bled more than a scrape would account for. He could have opened every throat in that yard. He chose not to, even now, even furious. It was the 4th man, young, frightened past sense, going for Neris directly, instead of the wolf between them, who forced what came next. There wasn't time to be an animal about it. Jaws could tear a wrist off a man reaching for a woman. Hands could simply take the blade away, so he became hands. Bone cracked and rearranged itself in the space of a breath. Fur receded like a tide going out all at once. Where the black wolf had stood, a man stood instead, tall and bare-shouldered in the moonlight, closing one hand over the boy's wrist and the blade in it, and setting both aside, as though disarming a child of a stick. The soldiers ran. Nerys did not. She knew the face. Everyone in the north knew the face. It hung in Ironfang's hall, same as every other, stern and gold-framed. The Alpha King of the North, rendered in oils by some court painter, who'd never once, Nerys thought distantly, captured the particular way his mouth turned when he was trying not to speak. "You're the king," she said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, disbelieving, in the specific way of someone doing arithmetic. She didn't want to finish. He didn't deny it. There was nothing left to deny. So she finished the arithmetic anyway, standing in the wrecked yard, among 3 broken swords. The fish, that first week, that she'd assumed was hunger, the rabbit she'd scolded him for, the storm, and his ribs against her back keeping the wind off. Aemon's name, said aloud, to what she'd believed was the one listener on this earth who could never repeat it. Her mother's silence, the blue shawl. Every private, unguarded thing she had handed to a wolf, because a wolf, she'd thought, could carry it nowhere. He had understood every word. "Why?" she said, and her voice, for the first time since he'd known her, was not steady. "Did you never tell me? I came for a mark on a dead man's collar," Rydian said. "I never meant to come back a second time. I didn't expect." He stopped and made himself finish it plainly, because she deserved that much if nothing else. "I didn't expect to want to. I kept returning, because being near you was the only hour of any day I didn't have to be a king. That's the truth. I should have given you the choice to send me away knowing who I was. I didn't, because I was afraid of exactly this." Something moved between them when he said it. A pull low in her chest, sudden and unfamiliar, as though a rope she'd never known was tied to her, had gone taut all at once. She saw it land in him too, some answering current behind his eyes he hadn't chosen and couldn't hide. She refused to let it matter. "I trusted a wolf," she said. "I never agreed to trust a king." He didn't reach for the bond, though it sat right there, humming, offered almost against his will. He only watched her turn, cross the yard, and disappear into the cabin, and did not follow. Darian found him still standing in the wreckage a few minutes later, having tracked his king's absences one time too many, to be left behind again. He looked at the broken swords. He looked at the shut cabin door. He looked, last, at Rydian, who hadn't moved. "You could order her to accept you," Darian said, not unkindly, only practical, the way he'd always been. "The bond's there. I felt it from 10 feet off. Say the words, and she has no choice left in it." "I could," Rydian said. He kept looking at the door, "and then I would become every man who ever hurt her." Darian, for once in his life, had nothing clever to say to that. He simply stood beside his king in the cold, and let the silence be the only company either of them had left to offer. He did not go back to her dock, not the next night, nor the one after. He told himself it was respect, the one gift he still had left to give her, and tried to believe it by filling the empty hours with ledgers instead of lavender. 4 days of quiet questions, asked in rooms where a king was never expected to be listening, turned up what 4 months of open war had not. A courier's route, logged under a name that belonged to no one in Ironfang's service. Silver, drawn twice from the treasury, against a campaign that had never happened. And at the end of the thread, not one traitor, but a small, comfortable circle of them. Garrick himself, and at least 2 men who sat close enough to his table to have signed the orders, without their own alpha ever needing to say the word aloud. The border ambush had never been an ambush. It had been a silencing. Kellen Ash and 2 others had found this same trail of silver months before Rydian did, and had died on a stretch of ground Garrick called enemy territory for the crime of finding it. Rydian carried the proof and told himself there would be time to bring it to Nerys once it was strong enough to end Garrick cleanly. He did not yet understand how little time either of them had left. Garrick understood it better. A soldier had already reported what the Omega hid inside her coat sleeve, and when his men limped back from her yard with broken swords and no ledger, he stopped weighing whether she was a danger and started deciding what to do about the fact that she was. He gave the order 2 nights later, under cover of a storm rolling hard off the western ridge. Not to bargain this time, to burn. Nerys smelled smoke before she saw flame, and by the time she reached her door, the west end of the dock was already a wall of orange fighting the rain and winning. 4 bodies had arrived that afternoon, still unwrapped, still waiting their turn on the barge tied at the end of the burning boards. She did not think of herself at all. She thought of 4 names she hadn't spoken yet. She ran straight into the fire's reach, past men already fleeing what they'd started, and dropped down into the barge among the dead, working the mooring knot with fingers gone clumsy from cold and smoke. The rope had half burned through already. It gave all at once, the wrong way, and the current took the barge before she'd found her footing. The storm did the rest. A swell caught the hull broadside, and the barge rolled, and the lake, flat and gentle every night she had ever known it, closed over her like something with a grudge. She went down, still holding the ledger. The cold took her breath before the fear could. She kicked once, twice, toward a surface she could no longer find in the dark, and felt her strength give out, long before her will did. The last clear thought she had, sinking, was not of the fire, or Garrick, or even Aemon. It was black fur, amber eyes, a heartbeat under her palm that had never once, in all these months, felt like anything but safe. He was already riding for the lake when the sky over Hushmere turned the wrong color. He had told himself he was only going as far as the tree line, to watch her dock from a distance that wouldn't cost her anything, because 4 nights of staying away had not made him want her less, only better at hiding it. He saw the fire from the ridge and stopped telling himself anything at all. He hit the water as a wolf, because a wolf was faster. He swam until the dark and the cold and the pull of the current told him that paws and fur would never be enough to find one small shape in all that black water, let alone hold on to her once he had. He shifted mid-lake, bone giving way to bone in a single wrenching breath, and swam the rest as a man, until his hand closed on wet wool and copper hair, and he hauled her against him and did not let go again. He got her to the shallows. He got her breathing. She came back slowly, lake water in her lungs and rain in her lashes, and the first thing she saw was a face too close to place, until she looked past it, into the eyes, amber, exactly as they had always been, wolf or man. Something in her chest that had been braced for days finally stopped bracing. "It was you," she whispered, not a question, not new information, something closer to surrender. The black wolf at her dock, the king in the yard, the man who had just pulled her from a lake that should have kept her. All of it, all along, one heartbeat she had never once mistaken for anyone else's. Ridian tightened his hold against the cold and the rain and did not loosen it to answer. "Every night," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. The ledger dried page by page on a flat stone beside the fire. Ink smudged, but the names still legible if she tilted them toward the light. And that, more than her own breathing, was what convinced Nerys she had actually survived the night. Ridian hadn't left. He sat across the low flames with his knees drawn up, watching her the way a man watches for a verdict he already expects to lose. She let him have it plainly, once she trusted her voice. "You lied to me for months." She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. "I told you about Aemon, about my mother never speaking to me again, about the shawl. I handed you every soft, unguarded thing I own, because I thought there was no one left on this earth to repeat it to. You knew. Every single time, you knew, and you let me keep talking." "I did," Ridian said. "That's not a small theft." "No. Trust isn't a coin you get to spend just because I didn't know whose pocket it came out of. I know that now." He didn't look away from her, and didn't reach for a single excuse to soften it. "I let you carry the worst nights of your life on your own back, and told myself it was permission, because you didn't know there was anyone left to ask. That was cowardice wearing a kind face. I won't call it anything gentler than that." She had braced for him to argue. He didn't give her anywhere to push. The storm had thrown 2 of the 4 unclaimed bodies up along the eastern shore by morning, tangled in reed and driftwood, their shrouds torn to ruin. Nerys expected him to send for men. Alphas sent for men. Instead, he waded in himself, boots and all, and carried the first one up onto dry grass with both arms, the way she did it, not slung over a shoulder like cordwood, the way soldiers carried their own dead when no one was watching. He asked her, quietly, for a fresh length of linen, and when she gave it to him, he wrapped the man himself, clumsy at first, then less so, tying the collar the same simple double knot she always used, tucking a sprig of lavender beneath it, without being told twice. Nerys stood back with her arms crossed, still furious, and watched anyway. It was the first time she let herself believe he'd actually been listening all those nights, and not merely enduring her. They rowed the 4 together towards Cinder Isle once the lake settled, and it was on that crossing, Oar Creek and grey water between them, that he finally told her the whole of it, start to end, with nothing held back for later. He told her about the battlefield, and lying down among his own dead, to learn what became of them, once no one thought a king was watching. He told her the fish had never been hunger, that he'd caught it clumsily, on purpose, for an excuse to set one paw back on her dock. He told her about a deer he'd taken from Garrick's own preserve, out of spite as much as appetite, and never once mentioned where it came from. He told her the storm hadn't been chance either. He'd smelled the weather turning and gone to her on purpose, wanting an excuse to lie against the hull all night. I was jealous of my own wolf, he admitted, low, not looking at her now. You gave him everything so easily. Your voice, your hands, your grief, and I knew the king would never have earned an hour of it. That ate at me more than I let myself admit. He told her the night she fell asleep against his ribs, telling him about Aemon, was the night he understood he loved her, and that he'd been afraid of exactly this moment ever since. Not Garrick, not the crown, but this. Her face, doing arithmetic, subtracting him from every soft thing she'd ever said to a wolf. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, he said, when there was nothing left to confess. I don't think I've earned the right to ask that yet. He asked for one thing instead, to learn the names, all of them, properly, her way, before the great remembrance took the fallen and turned them back into a number for the crowd. Nerys was quiet long enough that the oars found their own rhythm without her. Not because I forgive you, she said finally. The dead don't care whether you've earned anything. They only care whether someone still says their names right. If you mean to stand up in front of every northern pack and speak for mine, you'll do it without a single mistake. She reached into the boat and lifted the ledger, salt-swollen, into the grey light between them. 400 names, near enough, inked in her own hand, across years she'd stopped counting separately from the water. Then start learning, she said. The capital's ceremonial circle had never held so many at once. Every northern pack had sent someone, elders too frail to make the journey standing anyway, cubs lifted onto shoulders to see over the crowd, thousands of wolves pressed shoulder to shoulder around a ring of stone older than any hall in the city. They had come, as they came every year, to hear the dead counted, the bells rung, and the circle closed before dusk. Lady Sabine stood at Rydian's right hand, as she had stood at every remembrance for 30 years, a slip of parchment already folded into her sleeve, with the season's tally written in her own careful hand. She had opened this ceremony the same way since before he wore the crown at all. Her fingers found the parchment's edge as he stepped past her. He did not take it. He walked on, past the council dais, out to the center of the circle, where no king in living memory had stood alone. And the hush that followed him was not the practiced hush of ritual. It was the uneasy kind, the kind a crowd makes when it senses the script has changed and does not yet know for what. He said a name, not a number, a name, whole and unhurried, spoken the way he had first learned to say them on a lake 3 days south of here, at the insistence of a woman who believed a man deserved the whole of himself, back before the ground took the rest. Then the second name, then the third. By the 20th, Sabine's hand had gone still on her useless parchment. By the 50th, the circle stood in a silence so complete, his voice reached the furthest ring, without needing to be raised at all. The afternoon wore on. His voice roughened and did not stop. He did not hesitate over a single name, did not once ask which pack a man had come from, because for 3 weeks he had learned every one of them from a ledger that never let him take a shortcut. Word moved through the crowd, in murmurs too low to interrupt him. Someone taught him this. He hasn't missed one. No one in the north had heard their king speak longer than a battlefield order in 11 years, and here he stood, bareheaded in the old circle, giving the fallen more time than any ceremony ever had. He found her before he reached the end of the book, standing at the very edge of the circle, past the council benches and the seated lords, in the same worn brown coat she'd worn the night she pulled a blade from a stranger's shoulder without asking anyone's leave. No one had thought to seat her closer. No one there yet knew her name. He spoke the last one. Then, instead of returning to the dais, he crossed the grass toward her. "There is one name left unspoken today, and it is not written in this book," he said, loud enough now for every ring to hear. Nerys Vale, cast out of her birth pack at 16 for carrying her own dead when no one else would touch them. For 8 years, she has ferried the North's fallen to Cinder Isle and lost not one name to carelessness, and asked nothing from any pack in return. Everything I have spoken here today, she taught me, name by name. If I understand anything of what it cost to lead, it is because a woman this kingdom called cursed showed its king what none of you ever had the courage to. The silence that had held for the dead held again, differently, for her. He did not let it linger. He raised the ledger itself, salt-stained, its ink still faintly warped by lake water, and beside it, a scrap of parchment once sewn into a dead man's sleeve. 23 of the men I named did not fall to enemy steel, he said. They were sold, by Alpha Garrick Thorne, and by counsel enough near him to sign silver into a ledger no one thought a dead man would carry back out of the ground. The proof is in this book, in his own hand, and it will be read in full before this circle disperses. Garrick did not run. There was nowhere left to run to. The guard had him before the crowd's shock finished turning into something closer to fury. Sabine, who had not moved, who had not once reached again for her parchment, watched with a stillness that had stopped being about ceremony several minutes before. Only then did Rydian lift the crown from his own head. He crossed what remained of the circle, thousands of witnesses watching their king walk toward a woman in a lake-worn coat, and knelt in the grass before her. "I claim no right to your trust," he said, quietly now, though the whole North would hear of it by nightfall regardless. "I claim only what is already true, that you are my mate, and have been since before either of us agreed to it, and I will not spend that bond to answer for me now. I name you Luna of the North before every pack here, if you will have the title, but I am asking, Nerys, not the wolf, not the crown. Only asking, will you stand beside me, or send me back to the water without you?" She did not answer straight away. She stepped closer instead, until the crown lay forgotten in the grass between them, and pressed her palm flat to his chest, exactly where she had first found him breathing, among 23 shrouded strangers. The same heartbeat, slow, certain, waiting, as it always had, for her to come and find it. Nerys smiled, small, unhurried, the smile of someone who had already decided, and had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. She thought of that first night more often than she let anyone know. 23 shrouds, and then a wrongness in the count that turned out to be a king. A heartbeat under her fingers that had no business being there. A voice, dry as bone, telling her the dead went first, and getting only "you're late" in answer. For months she had believed there were 2 of him, the patient black shape that slept beside her burial boat, and the crowned stranger who had knelt in a ring of stone and given 400 dead their names back one by one. Standing now with her palm still warm from his chest, she understood there had never been 2. Only one man, worn down to his most honest shape twice over, once by fur, once by grief, and she had loved them both, without ever knowing she'd only met the one. "I'll stand beside you," she told him, before the crown ever touched her head, so there could be no argument later that she hadn't said it plainly. But not as something kept in your hall to be admired. She wanted terms, not vows. The dead would always be named. Every remembrance from here to the last northern winter, no fallen wolf reduced again to a number on a council's parchment. Her ledgers, and whatever came after them, would never again be a thing a frightened alpha could send 4 men to burn in the night. No packless Omega, in any pack that owed him fealty, would be called cursed again for the crime of touching what the living were too afraid to. And she would keep working, rowing when there were bodies to row, tying the lavender herself, keeping the book in her own hand, because it was the one thing she had ever done that mattered, and she hadn't fought this hard to trade it for a throne. Rydian agreed before she'd finished asking. He proved it not with a speech, but with every year that followed, in which not one line of it was ever broken. Lady Sabine found her in a corridor 2 mornings later, once the crowds had thinned, and the arrests had settled into paperwork. She did not apologize prettily. She said, plainly, that it had been her voice in Garrick's ear that first called the Omega's ledger a danger to good order. That she had spent 30 years believing ritual and number were what kept the North disciplined, and had decided, after her own son was carried home from a border, she'd never once let herself grieve. That softness like Neris's was the thing that let the chaos back in. Neris did not forgive her. She said so plainly too. But she understood, better than most standing in that hall, what grief did to a person, left with nowhere honest to set it down. So the punishment she chose was not exile, and it was not silence. Lady Sabine was given the North's first permanent Book of the Dead, and ordered to keep it herself, in her own hand, for as long as she lived. Every fallen wolf, every pack, every name spelled correctly, and never again folded into a season's tally. If tradition was what she had wanted to protect, Neris told her, then let this be the tradition she protected from now on. Spring came slow to the Hushmere, the way it always had, ice giving way to reed shoot, a softer light lying flat on the water by afternoon. The new dock stood wider than the old one, and lavender grew in boxes the length of it, already thick with colour, by the second warm week. No one ever gave Neris a straight answer as to who had planted it. There were no bodies that day, only the ledger open on her knees, the boat rocking easy at its mooring, and a black wolf stretched the length of the boards beside her, his head heavy in her lap, his tail resting warm across her feet, as if he had never once been anything else. She wrote. He dozed, or pretended to. After a while she laid her palm flat against his ribs, the way she had that very first evening, checking without needing to admit that was what she was doing. One slow heartbeat, then another, just as unhurried as it had ever been. "You're still cheating," she said. One amber eye opened, entirely unrepentant. "Only because you keep checking." She laughed, full and unguarded, the sound still new enough to surprise her every time, and bent back over her ledger and let him stay exactly where he was. Later, when the light went to gold, she untied the boat and rowed it out towards Cinder Isle once more. Not because anyone had died, but because the older graves wanted fresh lavender before summer took the scent, and because some habits were worth keeping, long after the reason for them had softened. The girl the elders had once called death-marked sat in the stern with a king's head against her knee, Luna of the North, by every account but her own quiet insistence on staying exactly who she had always been. The wolf who had once hidden among corpses to learn what became of them, now lay in the open, in full daylight, in front of anyone who cared to look. The dead, at last, were remembered. The living, at last, were healed. And the Omega once thrown away for carrying names no one else would touch, had become the woman who taught an entire kingdom how to love what it had lost. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.